The click of handcuffs echoed. "I didn't take it, Ryan. Please, you have to believe me." Walter, 79 years old, pleaded desperately. But his son didn't even look back. For just a watch, this elderly father was sent to jail by the very son he had sacrificed his entire life to raise. He would endure months of torment in solitude, while the real thief remained free, enjoying life in that very house. The truth was hidden by a simple camera, but when it's revealed, will it be too late to save a family that is already broken? Before we dive deep into this heartbreaking story, I want to know, where are you watching this video from? Leave me a comment, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join our community, where we reflect on life's deepest lessons together. Now, let's begin Walter's story. Walter was 79 years old and had spent almost his entire life working hard to give his son, Ryan, the best. A widower for over a decade, he had learned to cope with loneliness, hoping that his son, the only treasure he had left, would always be by his side. For years, he had owned a small corner store in the neighborhood where he lived, a modest business but enough to cover the family's needs. He would get up before dawn and close the store late at night, sacrificing hours of rest to make sure Ryan had opportunities he never had. He clearly remembered those days when he would come home with hands rough from work, his feet aching from standing so long, but with the satisfaction of knowing his effort put food on the table for his son and paid for his studies at a good school. He never complained, never asked for anything in return. He just wanted to see his son prosper, become a good man, and, above all, have him close when the inevitable weight of old age arrived. Ryan, now a 5-year-old man, had grown up with the firm belief that he deserved more than what his father could give him. He hadn't been an unhappy child, but the constant comparison with other friends whose fathers had better jobs, new cars, and bigger houses led him to develop a certain resentment. His mother had always spoken fondly of Walter, telling him how his father sacrificed everything for him, but those words weren't enough to prevent him, over time, from starting to look at his father with eyes of ingratitude. When he was a teenager, he felt ashamed of the modest clothes his father could afford him. In his youth, he avoided inviting friends over, afraid they would make fun of his small, simple home. Now, as an adult, married to Tiffany, a cunning and ambitious woman, the distance between them only grew. Tiffany, with her refined elegance and taste for luxury, reinforced the idea that Ryan had always deserved something better. With subtle phrases, disapproving glances, and strategic comments, she convinced him that his life could have been different if his father had been a more successful man. When Walter decided to sell his store, he no longer had the same energy as before. His hands trembled when he tried to count change. His eyesight failed when he read the numbers on products. The time had come to rest. With the money he received, he thought the best option would be to go live with Ryan. His son had a large house with several bedrooms, and it was logical that in his old age, he could count on him. He said goodbye to the store with a lump in his throat, remembering the years of effort he had dedicated to it, but with a heart full of hope that he could now enjoy his son's company. The day he arrived at Ryan's house, he carried an old suitcase with a few changes of clothes and a small box of memories, photos of his late wife, letters she had written him in their youth, some old dollar bills he kept fondly. Ryan received him with a polite gesture but without real emotion. He told him he could stay in one of the downstairs bedrooms, a cold, undecorated room, far from the warmth of the home he had imagined. Tiffany barely said a word to him, limiting herself to a forced smile before returning to her phone, as if the old man's presence were an immediate annoyance. Days passed, and Walter noticed his presence made his daughter-in-law, Tiffany, uncomfortable. She would let out sighs of annoyance when she saw him in the living room. Her answers were short and curt whenever he tried to start a conversation. At the dinner table, she remained silent or pretended to be busy with her phone while Ryan talked about work or business. Walter tried not to pay too much attention, telling himself that maybe she just needed time to get used to his presence. However, Ryan's behavior also began to worry him. His son, whom he remembered as affectionate and cheerful in his childhood, now seemed distant, as if his father's mere existence in the house was a reminder of something uncomfortable. He didn't invite him out, didn't ask how he felt, didn't dedicate more than scarce, formal words to him. One day, while Walter was in the kitchen, he heard Tiffany speaking in a low voice to Ryan in the living room. Her tone was annoyed, as if she were suppressing fury. She said it wasn't fair that a useless old man was taking up space in her house, that her father-in-law's presence ruined their home's harmony, and that she now had to cook simpler meals because there was another mouth to feed. Ryan didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds, in a tired tone, he said he didn't want problems and that they would find a solution. Walter felt a deep pain in his chest. He didn't want to be a burden to his son. He didn't want to be seen as a problem. He just wanted to spend his last years near the only family he had left. Despite Tiffany's silent contempt and Ryan's coldness, Walter tried to stay positive. He got up early to make coffee, cleaned the house in an attempt to feel useful, and tried to talk to his son in the few moments he was available. But everything he did seemed to annoy Tiffany. One day, after Walter accidentally spilled a little coffee on the table, Tiffany let out an exaggerated sigh and told Ryan she was tired of the situation, that having an old man in the house was unbearable, and that she didn't understand why she had to put up with it. Ryan, instead of defending his father, simply asked her to calm down and not to exaggerate. Walter pretended not to hear, but he felt his heart shrink. He had imagined his old age differently. He thought he would share afternoons with his son, remembering happy moments, that he would play with his grandchildren if he had any, that he would be loved and respected in his own family. But instead, he found himself in a house where his presence wasn't welcome, where his efforts to be part of the family were ignored or despised. Despite everything, he still clung to the hope that Ryan would remember how much he had loved him in his childhood, that one day his son would look at him again with the same affection as before. He didn't know that the worst was yet to come. One morning, just like any other, Ryan got up in a hurry. He checked his phone as he walked through the room and got ready to leave for an important meeting. He stopped in front of the mirror to put on his luxury watch, a gift he had given himself as a symbol of his success, an object that represented everything he had achieved in life. He reached out to the nightstand where he always left it, but his expression changed immediately when he saw it wasn't there. He frowned, checked more carefully, lifted some papers, looked in the drawers, on the dresser, on the nightstand. His breathing quickened. It couldn't be possible. He turned abruptly and walked to the bathroom, checking the sink, the shelf where he sometimes left things when he was rushed. Nothing. He felt a tingling in his chest, a mix of anxiety and contained anger. He left the room and went downstairs with hurried steps, calling for Tiffany in an urgent tone. When she appeared in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in her hand and an expression of annoyance at being interrupted, he told her he couldn't find his watch, that it had disappeared from his nightstand, and that he was sure he had left it there. Tiffany frowned and took a sip of her coffee before saying it must be somewhere, that he should check again. Ryan shook his head, irritated, saying he had already looked everywhere and the watch wasn't there, that someone had taken it. Tiffany narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms before asking in a slow, calculated voice who else had been in the room. Ryan let out an exasperated sigh, saying only the two of them lived in the house. But before he finished the sentence, Tiffany raised an eyebrow and added in a cold tone that this was no longer true, that now there was someone else. Ryan looked at her, not understanding for a moment, until Tiffany shrugged and said softly that Walter was the only one in the house who had nothing, that perhaps he had seen the watch and couldn't resist. And just like that, the seed of doubt is planted by a cold, calculating hand. Tiffany knows exactly what she's doing, but Ryan is about to make a choice that will seal his father's fate. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. His first instinct was to reject the idea, to say his father would never do something like that. But then he remembered the last few days, the moments when he had noticed Walter quieter, more withdrawn, as if he were hiding something. Suddenly, the idea no longer seemed so absurd. He walked with heavy steps toward the living room, where Walter was sitting in an armchair, looking through an old photo album. Ryan stood in front of him, arms crossed and jaw tight, before saying harshly that he needed to talk to him. Walter looked up and smiled tenderly, as he always did when his son spoke to him. But his expression changed when he saw the coldness in Ryan's eyes. He asked what was wrong, with a mix of worry and surprise. Ryan got straight to the point, saying his watch had disappeared and he wanted to know if he had seen it. Walter frowned and shook his head immediately, saying he had no idea where it was, that he had never touched his things. Ryan let out an incredulous sigh and said it was very strange because the watch was always on his nightstand and now it was gone, that only the people living in the house could have taken it. Walter opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment, Tiffany appeared in the living room and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, saying in a sharp voice that it would be easier if he just admitted the truth, that there was no need to keep pretending. Walter turned to her with a look of bewilderment and asked what she was implying. Tiffany shrugged and said casually that she understood life could be difficult at his age, that maybe he felt tempted upon seeing something so valuable and decided to take it without ill intent, but that the best thing was to return it before the situation became more complicated. Walter felt pressure in his chest, a sense of injustice and desperation that left him speechless for a moment. He looked at his son with anguish-filled eyes and told him he would never do such a thing, that he would never take anything from him without permission, that he was not a thief. Ryan, his arms still crossed, let out a dry laugh and said all he wanted was his watch back, that there was no need to make a scene, just hand it over and they would forget everything. Walter felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces, seeing the hardness in his son's face. He asked him to please believe him, that he was his father, that he had raised him with love and had never failed him. Tiffany clicked her tongue impatiently and said that was precisely why Ryan was giving him the chance to confess without major consequences, that anyone else would have already called the police. Walter stood up with difficulty, feeling his legs tremble, and looked at Ryan with glassy eyes, telling him that if he really believed he was capable of something like that, then he didn't know him at all. Ryan clenched his jaw and said coldly that all he knew was that his watch had disappeared and he didn't trust anyone else to have taken it. Walter put a hand to his chest, feeling a dull ache, as if every word from his son were a knife stabbing his heart. He tried to speak, but indignation choked him. Sadness paralyzed him. He couldn't understand how his own son could doubt him like that, how he could look at him with such contempt after everything he had done for him. Tiffany sighed and said she was tired of the drama, that if Walter wasn't going to tell the truth, then maybe they should take other measures. Ryan nodded slowly, his mind already clouded by suspicion, by anger, by his wife's influence. He said he had no more patience, that if his father didn't want to talk nicely, then he would be forced to do something about it. Walter felt the air grow heavy, that the home he had imagined for his old age was turning into a trap of distrust and accusations. He never thought his son, the same one he had cared for with so much love, would be capable of looking at him as if he were a stranger, as if he were a criminal. He swallowed hard and said he didn't know what else to say, that he could only repeat the truth. He hadn't touched that watch. He would never steal anything from his son. But it was too late. Ryan had already made his decision, and Walter had no idea the hell he was about to live through. Ryan ran his hands over his face, breathed deeply, and tried to convince himself that what was happening wasn't real. His father, the man who had raised him with so much effort, was in front of him, denying everything with a look full of anguish that, for some reason, couldn't move him as it once did. Tiffany remained by his side, arms crossed and expression hard, her lips barely curved in a gesture of disdain. She was the one who broke the silence with a firm, calculated voice, saying they couldn't keep tolerating this situation, that if Walter didn't want to admit the truth, the best thing would be to call the police and let them sort it out. Ryan turned his head toward her, surprised, as if the idea shook him for an instant. He said maybe that was an exaggeration, that they could still find the watch, that maybe his father had taken it without ill intent and would return it if they talked calmly. Ryan looked down, as if trying to avoid the weight of her words, but Tiffany didn't give him time to doubt. She said all they were doing was seeking the truth, that if Walter had nothing to hide, then there was no reason to be afraid. Ryan finally nodded, his lips pressed tight, and picked up his phone. Walter felt the world crumble around him when he heard his son say he needed the police at his house because a robbery had occurred. He tried to speak, tried to convince him this was a mistake, but Tiffany just looked at him coldly and said the more he insisted on denying it, the worse it would look when everything came to light. Time seemed to stretch cruelly as they waited. Walter sat on the couch, his hands trembling, feeling a weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. Ryan paced back and forth, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable, but doing nothing to stop what was happening. Tiffany, on the other hand, stood firm, with the confidence of someone who has already won the battle before it begins. When the sound of a patrol car parking in front of the house broke the silence, Walter felt his heart shrink. 2 officers got out of the vehicle with firm steps. One of them came forward and greeted them with a professional voice, asking what the situation was. Ryan explained quickly and curtly that his watch had disappeared and that there was only one person in the house who could have taken it. Walter felt a lump in his throat hearing him talk about him that way, as if he weren't his father but a stranger to be distrusted. One of the officers, with a serious expression, asked if they could check the accused's belongings. He opened his mouth to protest, to say he wasn't a criminal, but Tiffany stepped forward, saying of course they could, that they could check whatever they needed, that her husband just wanted his watch back. Walter had no choice but to watch as the police entered the small bedroom where he slept. They opened his suitcase roughly, pulled out his clothes with indifferent hands, rummaged through every corner looking for something they wouldn't find. They threw his few belongings onto the bed without care, checked every pocket, every nook. Walter felt tears burning in his eyes as he watched his most precious memories being treated like garbage, as if they were evidence of a crime. Ryan watched from the doorway, frowning, and Tiffany remained standing, arms crossed, waiting for the moment the truth she already took for granted would be revealed. After several minutes of inspection, one of the officers turned to Ryan and said they hadn't found anything. Ryan remained silent for a moment, as if his mind couldn't process what he was hearing. Tiffany pursed her lips in annoyance and asked if that meant they couldn't do anything. The other officer said that even if they hadn't found the watch, Ryan's testimony as the homeowner was still enough to detain Walter on suspicion of theft. No proof, no evidence, just the word of an angry son. As Walter is led away, he's not just losing his freedom, he's losing the very foundation of his life. And the nightmare is only just beginning. Walter felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He asked with a trembling voice how they could do this to him, how they could take him if there was no proof against him. The officer said coldly that it was standard procedure, that if he was innocent, he had nothing to worry about. Ryan said nothing as he watched the officers approach his father. Walter felt paralyzed as the firm hands of the police gripped his arms as if he were a dangerous criminal. He tried to turn to his son, tried to call out to him with a broken voice, telling him to please not let this happen, that he couldn't do this to his own father. Ryan clenched his fists and averted his gaze, as if avoiding his eyes made him less guilty. Tiffany, however, didn't hide her satisfaction as she watched the police lead Walter out of the house. The fresh air of the street hit Walter like a slap. Outside, some neighbors had already peeked out their doors and windows, curiously observing the scene. A couple of them murmured to each other, wondering what the old man had done to be taken out like that. Walter felt the heat of shame rise to his face and felt everyone's eyes staring at him like knives. His breathing became agitated when he saw the patrol car in front of him, when he realized that in a few seconds he would be inside that vehicle as if he were a criminal. He tried one last time to reason with Ryan, telling him with a broken voice to please stop this, that he couldn't let his own father go through such humiliation. Ryan remained silent, his face hardened, avoiding looking him in the eyes. Tiffany, with one hand on her hip, sighed and said the more he resisted, the worse it would be. One of the officers nodded and said it was best if he didn't resist. Walter felt an emptiness in his chest when the patrol car door opened and a firm hand pushed him gently inside. He fell onto the seat, his body rigid, his mind clouded by pain and disbelief. The door closed with a heavy thud, and the sound of the lock sealed his fate. As the patrol car pulled away, he could see his son's impassive face through the window, the hard gaze of the woman who had convinced him to destroy him, and the shadows of the neighbors morbidly watching the fall of a man whose only mistake was trusting in his son's love. Walter arrived at the precinct, feeling his entire body grow heavier with every step he took. The patrol car stopped in front of the grey, dilapidated building, a place where time seemed to have stopped, permeated by the smell of dampness and despair. One of the officers opened the door and gestured impatiently for him to get out. Walter tried to move quickly, but his age no longer allowed him to react as he used to. His legs trembled, his hands were still sweating from nervousness, and his breathing was shallow, as if he couldn't get enough air. When he stepped out, he felt slightly dizzy and had to hold onto the doorframe to keep from falling. The officer let out an impatient huff and told him not to put on a show, that it was better to walk on his own if he didn't want to be dragged. Walter swallowed hard and moved forward, feeling the gazes of the officers and employees at the station fixed on him like invisible needles. Some watched him with disinterest, as if he were just another routine case of an old homeless man who had done something wrong. Others looked at him with annoyance, as if his very presence were a bother in the middle of their workday. When they took him to the desk sergeant, a man with a tired face and deep dark circles, Walter tried to speak before they interrogated him. He said with a trembling voice that he was innocent, that he hadn't stolen anything, that his son was making a mistake. The officer didn't even look up from the paperwork on his desk. He barely shook his head before saying that everyone said the same thing, that if he was really innocent, then he should wait for the process and let justice decide. Walter felt his heart pound, his chest rising and falling with anguish, his mind struggling to understand how he had gotten to this point. He insisted again, saying it made no sense, that he was an elderly man, that he had never committed a crime in his life, that he just wanted them to call his son so he could reconsider. The officer let out a dry, humorless laugh, saying his son was the one who filed the complaint, that if he himself had pointed him out as the culprit, then there wasn't much to discuss. Walter felt his knees weaken. He had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing right there. Ryan's betrayal weighed on him more than any accusation, more than any other injustice he had ever faced. He couldn't understand how the boy he had raised with so much love, to whom he had given everything he had, could now look at him as if he were a stranger, or worse, as if he were a criminal. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape, but the officer's harsh voice snapped him out of his thoughts when he said they would take him to a holding cell while they decided what to do with him. Walter's eyes snapped open, and he felt a chill run through his body. He asked in a faint whisper if they were really going to lock him up, if it was necessary to treat him this way when there was no proof against him. The officer gave him an indifferent look and replied that because the complaint was filed by his next of kin, his son, they had to hold him pending arraignment. He said, "With no other address, and with the complainant stating you have no assets, the court considers you a flight risk." Walter tried to argue, to say he had nowhere to go, that his whole life was at his son's house, that he had no intention of running from anything, because he hadn't done anything wrong. But no matter how many words came out of his mouth, his fate was already sealed. A pair of officers grabbed him by the arms and led him down a narrow, poorly lit hallway. The air was stale with the smell of dampness and despair. Walter tried to stand tall, but his body no longer had the strength to resist. When the bars of the cell closed behind him with a cruel, metallic sound, he felt all his dignity crumble. He slowly sank onto the cement bench, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed. He took a deep breath, trying to contain the pain consuming him inside, but the tears finally escaped, rolling down his cheeks without him being able to stop them. It wasn't the cold of the place that made him tremble. It wasn't the hardness of the bench that made him feel so fragile. It was the weight of betrayal, the cruel certainty that his son had abandoned him, that the same child who once ran to him with open arms had now condemned him without hesitation. He ran a trembling hand over his face, clumsily wiping the tears, and let out a whisper that was barely audible in the empty cell. He asked himself in a low voice what he had done to deserve this, how it was possible that all the love he had given meant nothing to his son. The hours passed slowly and silently until he finally heard footsteps approaching. He looked up with a spark of hope, thinking that maybe Ryan had reconsidered, that he would realize the mistake he was making and get him out of there. But when he saw his son's expression, all hope vanished. Ryan was standing in front of the cell with a folder in his hand, his face cold and impassive, his gaze hard. Walter stood up with difficulty and asked if he had finally come to take him home. Ryan sighed and said no, that he had only come to sign the necessary documents for the complaint to move forward. Walter felt a blow to his chest so strong it took his breath away. He tried to take a step toward the bars, to reach his hand out to his son, to tell him to think carefully, not to make a mistake he couldn't fix. Ryan looked at him without emotion and said all he wanted was his watch back, that he couldn't make exceptions just because it was his father, that justice had to be served. Walter felt everything inside him shatter into 1,000 pieces, like fragile glass falling to the floor. His son no longer saw him as his father, but as a stranger, as a problem that needed to be solved. Ryan signed the papers quickly, without hesitation, without faltering, without showing a single glimmer of remorse. With just a signature, the betrayal is complete. Walter's last spark of hope is extinguished, and he is now truly alone, abandoned by the one person he gave everything for. When he finished, he closed the folder with a firm gesture and said he would make sure everything was resolved soon, that if Walter really hadn't done anything, then he had nothing to worry about. Walter couldn't say anything. His throat was closed by anguish. His entire body felt numb. Ryan gave him one last look and then turned to leave the room, not looking back. When the door closed behind him, the silence fell over Walter like a heavy slab. He sank back onto the cement bench, feeling his spirit crumble, his heart withering with every second that passed in that place. Never in his life had he felt such great pain. He had never imagined that the worst punishment wouldn't be the cold cell where they had locked him up, but the cruel abandonment by his own son. He closed his eyes and let out a choked whisper, a last attempt to cling to the only hope he had left. He repeated to himself that his son would one day open his eyes, that one day he would realize the mistake he had made. But until that day came, he would remain there, trapped not only behind the bars of that cell, but also behind the invisible bars of pain and sadness. A few weeks into his detainment, Walter was assigned a young, overworked public defender named Anna. She arrived with a stack of files and a tired expression, expecting another routine case. But when she sat opposite Walter, she didn't see a criminal. She saw the quiet dignity of a man utterly broken. She listened as he spoke, not in defense, but with the simple, devastating truth of a father who missed his son. Anna was the first person in months who looked at him without contempt. "Mr. Walter," she said gently, her professional demeanor cracking, "I don't have much, but I will fight for you. I believe you." She couldn't promise his release, but she promised he wouldn't be invisible. Anna began visiting weekly, bringing him warmer socks she'd bought herself and, more importantly, lending him an ear. She became his only human connection, the single thread of hope reminding him that decency still existed and that his story was worth being told. Her belief became a small, flickering flame that kept his spirit from being extinguished completely. The nights in the jail cell were endless and cruel. The cold was secondary. It was the silence that consumed him. In the dark, his identity unraveled. He was no longer Walter, the father, the hard-working shop owner. He was just the old thief in cell 4B. The physical chill seeped into his bones, but it was the cold of abandonment that truly froze him. He would huddle against the damp wall, not for warmth, but as an anchor against the terrifying drift of his own mind. He began to doubt his own memories. Had he loved Ryan too much? Had his sacrifices meant nothing? The betrayal didn't just break his heart, it erased his past, making his entire life feel like a lie. This was no longer just suffering, it was the slow, agonizing death of his spirit. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would hear the snoring of the other inmates, the sound of distant footsteps, the harsh laughter of the guards chatting among themselves, unconcerned about the suffering of those inside. Walter never thought his old age would be like this. He never imagined he would spend his last years behind bars, accused of something he didn't do, carrying the weight of his son's indifference. Hunger became a constant presence, a relentless reminder of his misery. The food they gave him was scarce, cold, and tasteless. A piece of stale bread, a watery soup with chunks of something unrecognizable floating on the surface, unsalted rice. He ate in silence, his hands trembling, feeling every bite like a humiliation, remembering the times he himself had prepared food for Ryan when he was a child, when he worked long hours to make sure his son never went hungry. And now it was he who had to endure an empty stomach. It was he who had to get used to the indifference of those around him. He didn't talk to the other inmates. At first, some mocked him, calling him the old thief, telling him an old man like him didn't belong in a place like this. One of them, a man with a cruel gaze and a crooked smile, told him he should be grateful, that at least here he had a roof over his head and wasn't dying alone in the street like so many others. Walter didn't answer. He just lowered his head and endured the words as he endured the cold, as he endured the hunger, as he endured the pain in his chest that never went away. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Walter lost track of time. The days were all the same. Each dawn brought the same routine of despair. But there was something that kept him alive, something that helped him not to give up completely. The letters he wrote to Ryan. With every trembling stroke, with every line written on the aged paper they gave him, he tried to capture what his voice could no longer express. He told his son that he loved him, that he never blamed him for anything, that he understood he was confused, but that he trusted one day he would open his eyes. He asked him to search his heart, to look for the truth, to remember the happy moments they shared when he was a child and ran to him with open arms, when they sat together in the store after a long day of work and shared a donut and a cup of coffee. He told him that no matter how much time passed, he would keep waiting, because a father never stops loving his son, no matter what happens. Every time he gave a letter to the guards to be sent, he felt a small spark of hope, a whisper of faith that told him that maybe, just maybe, Ryan would read his words and realize the mistake he had made. But the weeks passed, and he never received a reply. Every day that went by without a letter back, without a visit, without a sign that Ryan even thought of him, Walter felt his hope crumble, bit by bit. At first, he tried to convince himself that his son was busy, that maybe he hadn't received the letters, that Tiffany wouldn't let him respond. But over time, the truth became undeniable. Ryan had simply moved on with his life as if his father had never existed. While Walter fought against hunger, cold, and sadness, Ryan continued his routine without change, without a shadow of remorse on his face. He went to work as always, dined with Tiffany at fancy restaurants, traveled for business, and bought new things for his house. Sometimes, when someone asked about his father, he would respond with a shrug, saying the situation was complicated, that he was waiting for justice to do its job. Tiffany made sure to remind him that he had done the right thing, that a man like Walter, old and with no money, would always look for a way to take advantage of others. Ryan would nod and change the subject, not allowing himself to think too much about it, not allowing himself to remember his father's expression when they took him away in handcuffs, not allowing himself to question if maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. Time inside the jail moved differently, as if the clocks moved slower, as if the hours were heavier. Walter stopped writing letters when he realized he would never get an answer. He stopped talking to the guards, looking at the other inmates, hoping someone would help him. He became a shadow within those cold walls, an old man with a hunched back and dull eyes, a man who once had a life, a home, a son he loved, and who now had nothing. His hands, which once held Ryan as a baby, were now just frail bones covered in wrinkled skin, trembling and weak. His legs, which once walked miles to bring his son a gift on his birthday, could now barely support his own weight. Every night, when he closed his eyes on the hard bench that served as his bed, he wondered how much longer he could hold on. He wondered if Ryan even thought of him, if he would ever regret it. He wondered if the truth would one day come to light, or if he would die in there, forgotten, despised, becoming just another name on the list of those who passed through the jail and never left. And while the world kept turning outside, while Ryan lived his life without worries, Walter, in his small cell, kept waiting for a miracle, waiting for justice, waiting for the love of a son who, for some reason he would never understand, decided to forget him. Ryan arrived home after a long day of work. Tiffany was out, and the house felt unnervingly quiet. He went to Tiffany's desk to find a pen, but the drawer stuck. Annoyed, he jiggled it free, and a stack of papers hidden in the back slid forward. Among her credit card statements was a crumpled envelope, addressed to him in his father's unmistakable, shaky handwriting. His blood ran cold. It was one of the letters from the jail, marked "Return to Sender," but clearly opened and hidden. He had never received it. Tiffany had lied. With trembling hands, he unfolded the paper. It wasn't a plea for help. It was just a memory. "Ryan," it read, "do you remember the red Comet bicycle for your 10th birthday? I had hidden it in the shed, and you cried, thinking I forgot." A tear stain had warped the ink. Ryan collapsed into the chair, the letter clutched in his hand. The simple, loving memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not the letter of a thief. It was the letter of a father. A sudden, suffocating doubt consumed him. If she hid this, what else did she hide? That one simple question changes everything. The foundation of Ryan's anger is cracking, replaced by a cold, sickening dread that forces him toward the truth. This agonizing question is what led him to the security monitor. He wasn't checking for deliveries. He was searching for an alibi for his own soul. He didn't just scroll back. He typed in the exact date his watch disappeared, his heart pounding with a terrifying mix of dread and desperate hope. He needed to know. He had to see the truth, no matter how much it destroyed him. The video showed the living room with the same stillness as always. A normal day in the house. The sun filtering through the windows, the shadows moving slowly as the hours passed. Everything seemed calm until he saw Tiffany enter the scene. Ryan frowned, leaning his elbows on the desk as he watched intently. In the recording, Tiffany walked lightly through the house, making sure no one was around. She stopped for a moment, turned her head as if listening for a noise, and then, with quick movements, headed to the master bedroom. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. He adjusted the video playback and saw, with devastating clarity, his wife open his nightstand drawer, take out his luxury watch, and look at it for a few seconds. Her expression showed no doubt or regret, only the calculated coldness of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. Ryan held his breath when he saw what came next. Tiffany turned on her heel, watch in hand, and walked confidently to her own bedroom. She bent down, opened a jewelry box, and with a meticulous gesture, hid the watch under some necklaces and bracelets. Then she closed the box, smoothed her hair with her hands, and left the room with the same tranquility she had entered with. Ryan felt a knot form in his throat. His skin crawled, and his hands began to sweat as his mind struggled to process what he had just seen. He replayed the scene over and over, as if he needed to confirm it, as if at some point in the video the story would change and he would discover he was wrong. But he wasn't wrong. The truth was right in front of him, recorded with brutal clarity. He felt his chest tighten, a suffocating sensation washed over him, and his blood ran cold. All this time, he had lived convinced that his father was guilty. All this time, he had despised him, humiliated him, treated him like a thief without doubting for a second. He put his hands to his head and closed his eyes tightly, as if wanting to erase what he had just discovered from his mind. But it was impossible. The truth was a blow that had shattered his soul, a wound that could never heal. He remembered the way he looked at his father with contempt, the way he signed the complaint papers without remorse, the coldness with which he let him be taken away by the police without even giving him a chance to defend himself. He forced himself to open his eyes, feeling a sudden dizziness, as if everything around him were swaying. He put his hands on the desk and breathed deeply, but the air didn't seem to enter his lungs. He couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, but the image of Tiffany with the watch in her hand kept projecting in his mind, over and over, like an unbreakable sentence. He turned abruptly in his chair and looked toward the bedroom where his wife kept her jewelry. He stood up, feeling his legs weigh tons, and walked there like a condemned man, like someone advancing without strength toward a truth that will destroy him completely. He opened the door abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest. His steps were clumsy, his hands trembled as he took the jewelry box and opened it. His eyes scanned every piece, every chain, every ring, until finally he saw it. There it was, his watch, intact, hidden among Tiffany's belongings. Vertigo shook him violently. He felt his stomach churn, his muscles tense, his mind fill with a choked scream of despair. He held it in his fingers, feeling the weight of his own guilt, feeling the entire world crumbling around him. He fell onto the bed, watch in hand, his gaze lost on the ceiling. He felt nauseous. He felt rage. He felt a sadness so deep it seemed unbearable. His father had spent months in jail for something he never did, for a crime that he himself, his own son, had helped fabricate. He felt the pressure in his chest increase, an unbearable tightness that made him gasp. He wondered how he had been so blind, how he had allowed Tiffany to manipulate him that way, how he could have destroyed his father's life without even questioning it. His mind traveled to the last time he saw him, to Walter's devastated look behind bars, to the desperate plea in his eyes, to the way he ignored him without mercy. Ryan gritted his teeth, feeling the unbearable weight of his own guilt. His father was rotting in a cold, dark cell, suffering hunger, cold, and contempt, while he continued with his life without remorse, believing himself a just man, believing he had done the right thing. And it had all been a mistake, an irreparable mistake. He put his hands to his face, feeling desperation take over him, feeling the floor beneath his feet disappear, feeling that he had committed the worst sin of all. He didn't know how to face it, didn't know how to repair the damage he had done. But there was one thing he did know for sure. He couldn't go back. He couldn't erase what he had done, and he wasn't sure his father could ever forgive him. Ryan felt his body boiling from the inside, an unbearable mix of fury, guilt, and desperation that made him breathe with difficulty. He got up from the bed, the watch still clenched in his hand, his mind clouded by chaotic thoughts, images of his father, of his destroyed expression as they jailed him, of his own lips pronouncing that accusation without hesitation, of his signature stamped on the complaint that condemned him. He felt nauseous, remembering his coldness, the way he ignored Walter's pleas, the way he let Tiffany take over his judgment, manipulating him to his liking. He felt a fire in his chest that made him tremble with rage. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he knew Tiffany had just returned. He saw her enter with her carefree air, her designer purse hanging from her arm and her phone in her hand, as if nothing had changed, as if the world continued to spin in her favor. Ryan felt a savage impulse to scream, to destroy everything around him, to rip the mask of hypocrisy from her face with his own hands. He approached her with firm steps, his voice trembling with contained anger when he told her he had seen everything, that she shouldn't try to lie. He knew the truth. Tiffany blinked, disconcerted by his tone, and asked what he was talking about. Ryan held the watch in the air, his fingers squeezing it so tightly his knuckles were white, and said he had checked the security cameras, that he had seen her with his own eyes stealing the watch and hiding it in her jewelry box. Tiffany frowned, and her first instinct was to deny it. She said there must be some mistake, that she didn't know what he was talking about, that maybe someone edited the videos. Ryan laughed bitterly, a dry, lifeless laugh, and told her not to waste time making excuses, that he was no longer the blind man she had manipulated at her whim, that she couldn't keep lying when the proof was right in front of him. Tiffany narrowed her eyes, her face lost its air of innocence, and her voice turned cold as she asked what he planned to do with that information. Ryan felt his stomach churn at her audacity. He asked her how she could be so cruel, how she'd had the nerve to ruin an innocent man's life, how she could have manipulated him to the point of making him believe his own father was a thief. Tiffany snorted and rolled her eyes, as if the whole situation seemed an exaggeration to her. She said indifferently that what was done couldn't be changed, that Walter was just an old man, and that there was no point in being dramatic over someone who was already out of their lives. Ryan felt a blow to his chest, as if every word were a dagger piercing his soul. Unable to contain himself any longer, he shouted that she was a monster, that he couldn't believe he ever trusted her, that he was disgusted to have shared his life with someone capable of something so low. Tiffany crossed her arms and said coldly that he didn't have to shout, that if the truth bothered him so much, he could do whatever he wanted, but not to expect her to feel remorse for something that was already resolved. Ryan felt the rage explode inside him. His jaw tensed, and his voice came out firm and definitive when he told her he wanted her to get out, that he never wanted to see her in his house again, that she was not welcome in his life. Tiffany raised an eyebrow and looked at him mockingly, saying she wasn't planning on going anywhere, that the house was also hers, that if anyone should leave, it was him. Ryan didn't answer with words. He just walked to the door, yanked it open, and pointed to the exit, his face hardened by fury. He said coldly that if she didn't leave on her own, he would force her out. Tiffany looked at him in disbelief, but when she saw his expression didn't change, that his determination was unshakable, her face transformed into a mask of contempt. She said, with venom in her voice, that he would regret this, that he was nothing without her, that he was making a mistake. Ryan looked at him with a coldness unknown in him, and replied that the only mistake he ever made in his life was trusting her. The rage is justified, but kicking Tiffany out doesn't erase the sin. Ryan's guilt is now a tidal wave, and he's racing against time to undo an injustice that may have already broken his father completely. Tiffany grabbed her purse angrily and stormed out of the house, her silhouette disappearing into the night, leaving behind an emptiness that Ryan didn't feel as a loss, but as a relief. But the feeling of victory lasted only a few seconds. Guilt hit him with demolishing force. He looked at the watch in his hand, the symbol of the lie that destroyed his father, and felt the urge to run, to fix what he could still save. He left the house like a shot, without grabbing his jacket, without thinking about anything other than getting to the precinct and freeing his father. His heart hammered as he drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers hurt. Every second that passed, every red light, every minute he lost, made him feel more desperate. Finally, when he reached the station building, he got out of the car hurriedly and ran inside, breathing heavily, his chest tight. He approached the counter and urgently said he was there to drop the charges against his father, that it had all been a mistake, that he needed to see him immediately. The officer behind the desk looked at him with a mix of disbelief and contempt. His eyes narrowed, and his voice was loaded with sarcasm when he said that after so many months, now he decided to believe his father. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. His mouth opened, but he didn't know what to say immediately. He felt shame burning his skin, the humiliation of realizing that everyone in that room knew what he had done, that they all saw him for what he really was, a man who had betrayed his own father without hesitation. He swallowed hard and, with a trembling voice, said yes. He had been wrong. He had discovered the truth. His father was innocent. The officer leaned his elbows on the desk and looked at him with a raised eyebrow before saying, that's not how things worked, that it wasn't enough for him to change his mind now, that Walter had spent months in there paying for a crime he didn't commit. Ryan felt his world collapse, his mind echoing infinitely with the question of whether there was still time to repair the damage. His hands trembled, his breathing was erratic, and for the first time in his life, he felt what true fear was, the fear of having destroyed something he could never get back. When they finally opened the cell and called his name, Walter took a few seconds to react. He had been in there so long that his mind no longer conceived another reality. His body felt heavier, his skin was pale, and his bones protruded under the worn-out clothes they had given him. His trembling hands pressed against the cold wall to help him stand up. His legs faltered, and for an instant, he thought he wouldn't manage to stay upright. Dizziness washed over him, and he had to close his eyes for a moment, trying to gather enough strength to take a step. A guard told him he was free, that he could go, but his voice sounded distant, as if coming from another world. Free. The word made no sense. What did it mean to be free after spending so much time locked up, accused by his own son, forgotten by the only one who should have protected him? With clumsy steps, Walter crossed the threshold of the jail, feeling the cool air hit his face with a harshness that made him shudder. Outside, the sun was shining with an almost cruel intensity, as if the world had never stopped its course, as if everything had continued without him. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of the cell, blinked several times as his vision adjusted to the light. Then he saw him. Ryan was there, on his knees on the ground, his face bathed in tears, his trembling hands stretched out toward him as if begging to be heard. Ryan's regret is powerful, but look at Walter's eyes, they're empty. The man Ryan sent to jail is not the same man who just walked out. Can a simple, sorry, even begin to heal this kind of wound? His voice came out choked and broken when he said he was sorry, that there wasn't a single day he didn't regret it, that he didn't know how to repair the damage he had done. His body trembled with the weight of guilt. His breathing was erratic. His eyes reflected the desperation of a man who had destroyed the only thing that truly mattered. Walter looked at him without expression. His face, which in other times would have reflected love and tenderness at the sight of his son, was now an empty mask, a reflection of the deep sadness that had consumed him during the months of confinement. His eyes, once warm and full of life, now seemed like dark, silent pools, incapable of conveying any emotion. Ryan, seeing that emptiness in his gaze, felt his heart break even more. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the ground, sobbing like a child, saying he didn't deserve his forgiveness, that he knew he had killed him in life, that he had been an unworthy son, that he didn't understand how he could have believed such a cruel lie. He said he didn't expect him to forgive him, but to at least give him a chance to try to remedy the damage, even though he knew he could never make up for all the suffering he had caused. Walter remained motionless, his aged hands hanging at his sides, his breathing paused, as if each inhalation were a titanic effort. He observed his son with a silent sadness, like someone looking at something they once loved with all their being, but which now only reminds them of pain. Slowly, with visible effort, Walter raised one of his hands. Ryan flinched, expecting a blow he knew he deserved, but instead felt his father's rough, weak fingers trace his cheek, wet with tears. Walter looked at his son, his eyes clear of anger, but filled with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "My son," Walter whispered, his voice raspy from disuse, "you broke my heart." Ryan choked on a sob, his own guilt crushing him. "Dad, but," Walter continued, his grip tightening ever so slightly on Ryan's shirt, "you are still my son." It was not a complete absolution. It was not the easy forgiveness Ryan had selfishly hoped for. It was something more powerful, an acknowledgement of the pain and a refusal to sever the bond. He didn't say, "It's okay." He said, "You are still mine." For Walter, love was not the absence of pain, but the decision to hold on through it. That, Ryan realized, was the true meaning of a father's love and the true weight of his own failure. Walter's body swayed, and Ryan hurried to support him, his touch now gentle, as if afraid his fragility would make him crumble. He helped him stand, hugging him with an almost childlike desperation. "I don't deserve this," Ryan sobbed into his father's shoulder. "I can't forgive myself." Walter, weak, returned the hug, resting a trembling hand on his son's back. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The embrace, heavy with pain yet unbroken, said everything. But forgiveness didn't erase the past. Ryan knew it, and that certainty would stay with him for the rest of his life. He could hug his father, he could cry, he could ask for forgiveness 1,000 times, but he could never give him back the lost months. He could never erase the hunger, the cold, the humiliation. Walter had forgiven him, but the guilt would continue to consume him, reminding him every day that the trust he destroyed would never be the same. The only thing left for him was to be there, to care for his father, to dedicate every one of his days to showing him there was still time to mend what he had done. Finally, Ryan loosened the hug. He looked at his father with eyes swollen from crying and told him he would never leave him alone again, that he would dedicate every instant of his life to caring for him, that although he could never give back what he had taken from him, he would at least try to give him the peace he had denied him. Walter looked at him with a faint smile, that faint, serene smile of one who has seen the worst and decided to move on. In a soft voice, he told him the only thing he needed was for his son not to forget again what truly mattered, that no watch, no wealth, no one else's words were worth more than family. Ryan nodded, his soul shattered, but with the certainty that he would do everything possible to honor this second chance that his father, despite everything, had given him. Ryan put an arm around his father, supporting him carefully as they walked away from the jail. With every step, he felt the weight of guilt sinking deeper into his chest, but he also knew that for the first time in months, his father was not walking alone. Ryan dedicated the following days to caring for his father with a devotion he had never shown before. He helped him get up in the mornings, prepared his breakfast with his own hands, making sure the food was nutritious and hot, that he lacked nothing, that he would never again feel hunger or cold like in that dark cell where he had left him. He worried about his rest, his health, about every detail that previously seemed insignificant, and that he now understood was the only thing that truly mattered. He learned to support him carefully when they walked together, to notice when his hands trembled from the effort, to adjust the pillow under his head so he could sleep better. He discovered that his father never complained, never asked for anything, but his eyes reflected a deep exhaustion, not just physical, but an exhaustion of the soul, a resignation that Ryan feared might never disappear. Every time he saw him in silence, looking out the window with that absent expression, he felt the weight of his guilt become unbearable, as if every second of suffering Walter had endured still floated in the air and could never be erased. One day, while organizing the few belongings his father had brought from the jail, Ryan found a small packet of carefully folded papers, tied with a thin, worn string. His name was written in his father's shaky handwriting, and in that instant, he felt a lump in his throat. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, and began to read. As his eyes scanned each line, his breathing became irregular, his heart pounded, and the pain he thought he'd felt upon discovering the truth now transformed into something much worse. Walter had written those letters from his cell, alone, in the midst of cold and despair, without knowing if he would ever read them, without expecting a reply, with no company other than the echo of his thoughts. In every word, Ryan felt his father's sadness, his unbreakable love, his inability to hate him even after being betrayed. In one of the letters, Walter told him he didn't understand how he had ended up in that place, that he never imagined the child he had held in his arms would one day look at him with contempt, that his only comfort in the darkness was remembering the moments when they were still happy. In another letter, he told him that every night he closed his eyes and pretended he was at home, that he dreamed of hearing his son's voice telling him it had all been a misunderstanding, that the nightmare was over. He told him that no matter how much time passed, his father's heart would keep waiting, because a father's love doesn't break, not even when it's trampled on. Ryan felt a heartbreaking sob rise in his throat. The pages in his hands trembled with the same intensity that his soul shattered into 1,000 pieces. He put his hands to his face, the tears falling uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking with the unbearable weight of regret. He couldn't believe what his father had endured, the suffering he himself had caused, the pain he had ignored so coldly. He remembered every cruel word he had said to him, every look full of distrust. Every night he slept peacefully, while his father endured hunger and loneliness within four walls. He felt an unbearable anguish, realizing that while he went on with his life as if nothing had happened, his father only had these letters, these pages he thought Ryan might never read, these words he sent, knowing he might never get a reply. Ryan felt his chest tighten, that never in his life had he felt such great guilt, that never had a truth destroyed him so much. He's not just reading letters, he's reading the diary of his father's suffering, written while he himself lived in comfort. This is the true weight of his guilt, and it's a burden he will have to carry forever. Walter entered the room with slow steps and saw his son with the letters in his hands, his eyes red from crying, his face broken by sadness. He approached calmly, with that unbreakable patience he had always had, and sat beside him. Ryan tried to speak, but his voice broke before he could pronounce a word. Walter placed a frail hand on his shoulder and, in a soft voice, told him not to cry anymore, that what happened didn't matter now, that they still had time to recover what was lost. Ryan looked at him in disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how, after everything, his father was still capable of uttering those words. With a broken voice, he told him he didn't know how to go on, that he couldn't look at his own reflection without feeling contempt, that he had done something unforgivable. Walter looked at him tenderly, with the wisdom of one who has lived long enough to understand what is essential, and with a whisper, he told him that lost time couldn't be recovered, but they could still build happy moments if he was willing to try. Ryan felt his heart tighten even more. Everything he had sought in his life, everything he had valued, all the material things he had placed above his father's love, now seemed insignificant. He understood with brutal clarity that he had spent too many years worried about money, about appearances, about the validation of others, while the man who had loved him most only wanted his company, only wanted his affection. He felt miserable realizing he had wasted so much time chasing things that would never give him the peace he now felt with the simple presence of his father by his side. He looked at his hands, which had signed an unjust complaint, which had pushed his own father towards suffering, and for the first time in his life, he realized that nothing he had accumulated had any value if he had lost the only thing that truly mattered. With a deep sigh, Ryan took his father's hand in his and promised him he wouldn't let a single day more be wasted, that he would do everything possible to give him the life he deserved, that although he could never make up for all the pain he caused, he would dedicate the rest of his days to showing him how much he loved him. Walter smiled sweetly, his tired face reflecting understanding and peace, as if he had never expected anything else, as if he had always known his son would one day understand. And in that moment, Ryan knew his life would never be the same, because he had finally understood what truly had value. The days turned into months, and the months into years. But this time, every moment held a profound meaning for Ryan. He didn't let a single day pass without caring for his father, without being present in his life, without making sure Walter knew how much he loved him. He dedicated himself with devotion to making the years he had left the happiest possible, trying in every way he could to mend what he had broken. Walter, with his slower gait and his body growing frailer, found comfort in the constant company of his son, in the time they now shared without barriers or resentment. They spent the afternoons together in the backyard, where Walter used to sit and feel the breeze on his face while Ryan read him a book, or they simply talked about life. Sometimes Walter told stories from the past, memories of his youth, of Ryan's childhood, of his deceased wife. Ryan listened attentively, marveling at every word, wondering how he could have spent so much time without valuing these simple moments that were now the most precious thing to him. In every conversation, Walter imparted a different lesson, not with reproaches or sadness, but with the wisdom of one who has lived, to understand what is essential. One day, while sharing hot tea at the dining table, Ryan confessed to him that he still felt guilty, that even though his father had forgiven him, he couldn't forgive himself. Walter looked at him tenderly and told him that forgiveness is a gift one gives, but trust is something only time can restore. He explained that when someone breaks something, it's not enough to glue the pieces back together, that there will always be marks, but that the important thing is to show with actions that the mistake won't be repeated. Ryan nodded, his heart heavy, understanding that although his father had accepted him back into his life, the damage he caused could never be completely erased. He told him with a firm voice that he would do everything possible to make his last years the happiest, that he wouldn't rest until he gave him back a little of the love he had given him his whole life. Walter smiled with immense sweetness and told him he didn't need to do anything extraordinary, that his presence was already enough. The years passed with a serene calm, filled with small routines that became treasures for them. Ryan learned to appreciate every morning coffee shared with his father, every slow walk through the park, every conversation in the twilight. He accompanied Walter to the doctor, ensuring he received the best treatment, paying attention to every recommendation, protecting him with a dedication he had never shown before. He became the son he always should have been, the man Walter always hoped he would be, someone who understood that true wealth wasn't in money or possessions, but in family, in time shared, in the unconditional love that cannot be bought or recovered once it's lost. One afternoon, as the golden sunlight streamed through the window and covered the living room with a warm glow, Ryan noticed his father looked more tired than usual. Walter was sitting in his favorite armchair, his hands clasped on his lap, looking at the sky as if lost in thought. Ryan approached and took his hand gently, feeling the wrinkled, warm skin beneath his fingers. He asked if he wanted anything, if he needed him to bring him something to make him feel better. Walter turned his head slowly and looked at him with an indescribable peace in his eyes, as if there was no sadness or worry left in him. He told him he didn't need anything, that he had everything he could wish for, that life had given him the chance to spend his last years with his son, and that was enough. Ryan felt his eyes fill with tears. He squeezed his father's hand tighter and, with a trembling voice, promised him he would never disappoint him again, that he would love him and care for him until his last day. Walter smiled and closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the warmth of that hand holding his, as if that simple gesture were the answer to all his prayers. Days later, when his father's absence became a painful silence in the house, Ryan found himself standing in Walter's room, surrounded by his things, feeling an indescribable emptiness in his chest. He looked at the still-made bed, the table with the books they used to read together, the jacket folded carefully on the chair. His gaze shifted to a small drawer in the nightstand, and upon opening it, he found an envelope with his name, written in the same shaky handwriting he had seen on those letters from jail. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his eyes clouding before he even read the contents. With his heart pounding, he slid the paper out of the envelope and began to read. The letter was brief, but every word carried the weight of everything they had lived through. Walter told him he was proud of him, that he always knew his son would find the right path, that even though life separated them for a while, he never stopped loving him. He thanked him for every day they shared, for every moment he could look him in the eyes and know the love between them was still intact. He told him that life is short, that he shouldn't regret anything, that he should move forward with the certainty that he did everything he was supposed to do. Even in his final goodbye, Walter's only thought was to free his son from guilt. It's a testament to a love that endured the unthinkable, leaving us all to wonder if we could ever be so strong. Ryan let out a sob, clutching the letter to his chest, feeling the pain and love mix inside him in an impossible storm. He looked at the sky with tear-filled eyes and with a broken voice, whispered as if his father could still hear him, "Thank you for never stopping loving me, even when I stopped loving you for a while." He closed his eyes and let the tears fall, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, as if in that instant Walter were there hugging him one last time, reminding him that true love never disappears, that forgiveness is the greatest gift one can receive, and that although life took time from them, the most important thing is that they found their way back to each other. And with that certainty, Ryan knew that even though his father was no longer physically by his side, he would never be alone again. The truth was finally revealed, but the price for blindness was far too high. This story shows us that sometimes we chase glittering things like money or a luxury watch to the point that we forget the irreplaceable value of family. Walter forgave, but the scar of betrayal will remain forever. The question I want to ask you is, if you were Walter, could you be generous enough to forgive the son who destroyed you? And do you believe Ryan truly deserved that forgiveness? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to explore more emotional journeys with me. Thank you for listening. See you next time.